When you train for any sport, the goal is adaptation. You want to adapt the body in order to be better prepared for the next stimulus, so you can keep progressing through time. There's many ways to drive that process. You can up the intensity, up the training volume, or you can do both. But I think there's many misconceptions on how these training principles are defined and applied, certainly in the sport of fitness, where the mantra always has been intensity over volume. So in this video, I will react to a very interesting conversation between Sevan Matosyan and recent CrossFit Games winner Jayson Hopper, and I will use some of his comments to clarify these training principles. I think you will get a lot out of this video for your own training, so without further ado, let's go straight into it. Hi everyone, I'm Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and my goal now is to bring some of that science back to you guys. So if you clicked on this video, you probably know already that Jayson Hopper just won the CrossFit Games, one of the most brutal fitness competitions in the world. And I always find it fascinating to listen to big competition interviews of big athletes, for example, now of Jayson, but also, for example, if you want to listen to a very good one, I think about overtraining, is the one from Hunter McIntyre, where he talks about extensively how he lost the 2023 Hyrox Championships in Nice. Well worth your time as well. But we're here for Jayson Hopper. Why? Because he talks in his recent interview with Sevan about training intensity, training volume, and how the overall training load affected his whole training progress. And I think it's very fascinating to comment on this and also to have a listen to what he actually had to say.
I got cut because it was a training effect. Like I did the training wrong. I wasn't doing a lot of intensity in training. So that's why I got cut at the CrossFit Games. Got there and I was just flat because I just beat my head into a wall and had no intensity and way too much volume. I was overtrained.
So here he says, he talks about his 2023 period where he wasn't performing up to his standards. He was overtrained, he was doing too much volume, so he was not able to get the intensity in. So what does he mean actually with volume, intensity, training load? Let's define that. So training intensity is basically how much work you can do in a certain time frame, usually per second. So how much ATP, how much energy the body can produce within a certain time frame. So your actual power production. Let's look at, for example, your energy systems, right? You have learned this in your CrossFit level 1 or in biology class, that we always have energy systems to provide or to convert the energy needed for exercise or for other movements. And the creatine phosphate system, so the ones that are on the left side, and also the glycolytic systems are the ones that are typically used in CrossFit. And with those, we can produce a lot of power, so a lot of intensity in a short time frame. For example, a 200-meter run will always be more intense than, for example, a mile run or a marathon, of course, right? Even though you might feel very exhausted after the marathon or the mile run, maybe even more than after a 200-meter run, the intensity is always higher in the short time frame where you produce a lot of power. And then you have on the other side the total amount of work you're doing, and that is the training volume. For example, for resistance training, you can look at it as the amount of sets you do, the amount of reps you do within a certain week. For endurance training, it's usually defined as the amount of hours you're able to run, to row, to cycle, or the distance you're able to cover. And then for CrossFit, you can also look at, I like to look at it as hours, amount of hours you're training, or the amount of volume, like actual reps you're doing per movement. For example, this weekend or this week, I did 25 chest to bar pull-ups, I did 100 wall balls, and so on and so forth. That would be your total training volume. And then that is where the misconception comes along a lot of times, is you have also the training load. And the training load, or the toll on your body, that is really defined by the intensity times your total training volume. And that would be an important consideration also in this conversation, because how we do it with our training plans and with wod-science, we talk about training load as TRIMP or training impulse. It's a well-defined concept in exercise physiology and also in research, where you literally have the session RPE, so how intense it feels, the rate of perceived exertion, and you multiply that by the session volume, or how long that session was. For example, I did this morning a zone 2 run. That was for me RPE 3, but it took me 60 minutes, so the total TRIMP, the total training load, is 180. And this you can then obviously plot out over a long period of time. For example, I did this for different phases in the season. For example, here you see off season, where I have 12 sessions, for example, 2 weeks. And the goal is to build training volume. Important consideration here. And we have, this is just hypothetically, we have an intensity, we have a duration, and then we have our total TRIMP. And what we do with wod-science, we also multiply the TRIMP by 1.2 when there's a lot of eccentric contractions involved, because we know that eccentric contractions are actually exponentially affecting your training load. So what you have is weightlifting and mixed modalities, which is CrossFit. We multiply the TRIMP by 1.2. And here it gets interesting, because we know then over those 12 sessions, the total training load of the athlete, all right? Independent, or to some extent independent of the intensity and independent of the volume. You really have to add them up together, because you can see here, for example, our average RPE during the building phase, the building volume phase, is going to be 4.5. And the total duration was 710 minutes, which is whatever, 10 hours, a bit more than 10 hours, right? And the total TRIMP, so the total load on the body in this hypothetical example, is 3,400 arbitrary units. But then you can also look at it as, and that's a little bit exactly what Jayson is talking about, in competition, in season prep, where you want to prep whatever 1 or 2 months before a competition, where obviously the intensity will be much higher, but maybe the volume, the total volume, will be lower. And again here, the average RPE of this hypothetical example is much higher, 6.75 of mixed modalities and everything put together. And then you have the duration, which is lower, which is only 10 hours compared to whatever 12 hours in my previous example. But still, because intensity is that much higher and you have more mixed modality work, more eccentric contractions on your body, we're going to have a much higher 15 to 20% higher TRIMP. And that TRIMP is going to be what affects his, let's say, overreaching state, and also his over or super compensation.
And, you know, I podiumed at Rogue weighing like 220. So when I did that and I podiumed for the first time at a competition, I was like, you know what? I don't want to be any heavier than 220. And that was kind of the goal. Like, I felt great at Rogue, and, you know, I podiumed. That was my first time. So I was like, this must work. This must be the working weight, if you will. And then as we got deeper into the season, I just realized that I'm always hungry. So I got to keep eating. You know, I can't go on a cut. I can't like starve myself. Like, I got to keep fueling for training. And, you know, I naturally just over time just kept climbing up to 230. And I think a lot of that was probably some inflammation over the last two months, just training load inflammation. But yeah, I really had no choice. But the thing is, the intensity was super high. It's been high. It was the highest it's ever been over my, you know, 5-year career this past summer. So I knew, like, hey, the intensity is there. I feel great. I'm healthy. And if I try to cut, if I try to lose weight, I could probably compromise my health and get hurt with the volume and intensity that I'm trying to sustain.
So here he exactly talks about this. He had to dial back the volume, I would say the training load, to be able to do all that intensity. It's impossible to have both high intensity and both high training volume at the same time. You have to kind of compromise somewhere. Certainly in the sport of CrossFit, because the metcons are very intense by nature. There's a lot of instant power production, and we know that instant, very high power production in a split second of your time is going to be overall very fatiguing. If you know or understand the graph that I just going to show, now you can understand all the training plans and how to program for basically every sport. Let's dig into it. So here you see the color scheme going from green, which is zone 2, very aerobic work, towards red, your zone 5, your zone 6, high anaerobic, super sprinty work, right? So the color scheme is basically the intensity of the exercise that you're doing. Can be CrossFit, but also other sport, obviously high rocks and triathlon, whatever. And then it says the top graph says the maximum duration an athlete is theoretically able to do in that zone. We all know that if you're doing zone 2 work, that you can keep going. There's no real effect on recovery or very low effect on recovery, certainly when you use ergs and not do running. And then on the bottom one, you see exactly what I said. The black line means that the more intense you work, there's an exponential increase in physiological strain. And that's exactly why for CrossFit, this is important, because you are working a lot in this glycolytic system, and there's an exponential increase on your physiological strain and hence your recovery that you have to take from this. So when Jayson says, I was doing a lot of volume and therefore I couldn't do the intensity, that makes complete sense. If he drops the volume and does only whatever, 1 or 2 workouts really hard per day, he can go very hard in that intensity. But does that mean that you always have to do this strategy as kind of what is explained or what is agreed upon in this discussion? I don't think so. Let's look a little bit further.
As a generalization, are you saying that you've realized that obviously you still have to do a lot of volume, but the premium, like Glassman used to say, the magic is in the intensity? Like you really just have to get the intensity in, even if it means less volume?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there was many pieces in training this past summer where I had to just not do it because, I looked at it and I was like, hey, this isn't going to be 100%. This isn't even going to be 90%.
Yes, so for him, this might be correct. He has already a training background with a lot of volume, a lot of training in general, and hence doing too much high intensity volume and hence training load will not help him on the long term because it just overreach and overtrain him. But what we showed is kind of the opposite of what these guys actually agree on. 1 year ago, we did the Zone 2 study. Maybe you've seen a video, otherwise I will let it pop up on the top of your screen now. And what we did basically is we had one group that trained traditionally, where they, traditionally, not really, like commercially, where they did 5 days per week, high intensity strength combined with a high intensity metcon, like usually how people are training when you watch this video, when you're training in the gym. But then we had another group that did 3 times per week, a Zone 2 session instead of the high intensity work. So we decreased the total training intensity, but we kept the total training load, so they trained more, the same. Very important question here. So the training load was the same, but the intensity in the Zone 2 guys was a lot lower. And what we saw is that on all the aspects or all the different performance parameters of CrossFit that we measured, meaning strength, mixed modalities, but also FTP, like pure endurance, there were no differences between the groups. So in my opinion, it's not necessarily true, at least not from our experience, that the magic per se is in the intensity. It's rather a manipulation of training load, and most importantly, you have to be able to do the intensity to actually go hard while being well recovered when you go into the session. And that's exactly, I think, what Jayson means here.
There was various times this summer where I was just like, hey, I can't do this. It's going to be at 85%. It's not worth it, And there have been many times where I had to quit, stop in the middle of a workout. Like the intensity is not here. The intent of this workout is, whether it's chest to bar and thrusters, it's, high speed, it's sell out, empty the tank. It's got to be at 100%. And I could maybe start it at one time and, I was like, all right, it's not there. And a lot of people would be like, you're a quitter, blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, no, I feel like everything I do, I want to be able to maximize the intensity of this because that's what it's going to be like at the games.
So funny, exactly this, right? If you want to go high intensity, you need to be well recovered going into the session. And if you always do a combination of high volume and high intensity, obviously you will be overtrained and there's no way to do the programming that was intended for Jayson. Maybe a little caveat or at least a second thought on this. That doesn't mean that volume per se is bad. I would actually say in certain parts of the season, it might be a good idea for CrossFit Games athletes, but also for RX athletes and other athletes to do more volume, but just at a lower intensity. For example, what we are able to do now is to assess or to individualize your intensity based on the wod-motions sensor. So basically what we do an exercise test to exhaustion, we using thrusters and burpees, so functional movements, and based on your lactate threshold too, so your anaerobic threshold, we are able to transfer those movements or the intensity of those movements to other workouts. So for example, then you can design a workout for an athlete, a 30-minute EMOM, for example, that hits exactly the thresholds or sub-threshold of that athlete. You can even do this with zone 2 training. So in this case, for example, in the case of Jayson Hopper, we could say, okay, he can go 3 hours per day, but just always sub-threshold or even at zone 2 pace, meaning that he will be able to do a lot more volume, not at the highest intensity ever, but accumulate a lot more volume that will increase his aerobic base using functional movements, and then dial back the volume and go super high intensity when, for example, the CrossFit Games season starts. So that was a thought that I think was some misconceptions, that it's not exactly the training volume that is usually the problem, it's rather the training load, the combination of intensity and volume. Cool, that was it from my part today. I hope you liked these insights. Thanks Sevan and Jayson for the full conversation. I obviously will link their conversation or their podcast in the description below. If you're interested in training with us in a more evidence-based way, where we really try to nail down the training load, the intensity and the volume in different phases of the season, have a look at our training plans that we do for functional fitness, but also for Hyrox. You can scan the QR code that is popping up right now, or just click the first link in the description. Thanks for watching, and if you want to have a deeper dive into what I just said about how to define thresholds using functional movements, have a look at the video that is popping up right now. See you in the next one. Ciao.